They did not sell Nadia Bellini's body at the charity auction. They sold the right to decide where she would be sent next. The Saint Aurelia Charity Gala glittered under chandeliers that had been imported from a palace nobody remembered the name of: crystal, champagne. White roses arranged in columns along the aisle. A string quartet playing something composed for occasions exactly like this one. Occasions that needed to sound generous. Men in tailored black sat in reserved rows near the front. The kind of men whose names appeared on territory maps rather than business cards. Their wives sat beside them in gowns that cost more than most households earned in a year, applauding charitable causes they would never personally administer. The gala called itself the War Widows Relief Foundation. It had existed under various names for 40 years. It had never once been audited by anyone outside the families that funded it. On the stage, Nadia Bellini stood in a dress the gala had chosen for her, black, silver at the edges. She was not bound. She was not pushed. No one called her merchandise. The system was too refined for that word. Nadia had grown up knowing the language this system used. Her own mother had disappeared into a charity transfer when Nadia was 12. She had been told, for years afterward, "Your mother was saved by the foundation." No one had ever told her where the foundation had sent her. No one had ever shown her a file. No one had ever answered the simplest question a daughter could ask. If my mother was saved, why did she never come home, and why did the word saved sound every time someone said it to her, like a door closing rather than opening? Nadia had learned to manage real widow funds as an adult specifically because of that silence. She had learned which accounts moved money honestly, and which ones existed only to launder the appearance of charity over the machinery of control. She knew, standing on this stage tonight, exactly what kind of machinery she was standing inside. Father Aurelio Crane stood at the podium and smiled at the room the way men smiled when they were about to ask for money and call it virtue. He said, "Tonight, we honor a protected widow of the Bellini house." The room applauded. Nadia did not bow her head. Below the stage, the bosses and patrons sat in their reserved rows, clapping as if they were doing something honorable. Theo Cross sat further back, under the identity of a minor donor, watching the small pearl that had just slipped from Nadia's necklace and rolled to the edge of the stage. An old signal. She was not standing there willingly. Theo had learned this signal from a woman who was not Nadia. His own mother had been entered into a widow patronage program 11 years ago. No one had called it a sale. They had called it relocation under charity protection. He had believed, for most of his adult life, that his mother was dead. 2 years ago, working a different contract, he had found her name in an old ledger. Beside her name had been another name, one that had supposedly stopped existing a decade earlier, Lucien Vale. Theo had learned, in that single discovery, something he had never been able to unlearn. In this world, women did not always disappear because of war. Sometimes they disappeared because of paperwork. Father Aurelio asked, "Do we have an opening patron?" A paddle rose, then a second, then a third. Theo raised his. He did not say a number. He said, "Lucien Vale." The room went silent. It was the specific silence of several hundred wealthy, dangerous people simultaneously recalculating whether the man who had just spoken was a fool, a corpse waiting to happen, or something they did not yet have a category for. Father Aurelio lost his smile. Octavia Varone lowered her eyes. Nadia looked at Theo. Not the way a person looked at someone who had just bid for her. The way a person looked at someone who had finally said the name of the cage out loud. 3 days earlier, Dante Bellini had been ambushed outside his own territory. He survived. The council declared him temporarily absent in authority. Nadia requested to see her husband. The council refused. They said she needed to be placed under protection. She said, "Do not call me protected when every door here opens away from me." They invoked the protected widow clause. She told them Dante was not dead. She was not a widow. A council advisor answered, "Widow is not always death. Sometimes it is temporary legal absence." He said it the way men said things they had said many times before, in many rooms, to many women who had asked the same question Nadia was asking now. The phrase had clearly been used before. It had the smoothness of something rehearsed, something tested, something that had survived enough confrontations to be trusted as a closing argument. Nadia understood, hearing it, that she was not the first wife to stand in this room and ask why her husband's survival did not protect her from being filed under his absence. She understood she would not be the last unless something about tonight changed. Theo tried to accompany her. He stood in front of the council representative and said, plainly, that Dante had assigned him to Nadia's protection and that assignment had not been revoked by Dante himself. The representative said the assignment was now superseded. He said a husband's guard had no standing over a council-protected widow, regardless of who had given the original order. He said this without raising his voice, because raising his voice would have suggested he was aware of doing something that required defending. Theo looked at Nadia. She gave him the smallest nod, the kind that meant, "Not here. Not yet." The council stripped his assignment. A husband's guard had no standing over a council-protected widow. Nadia did not scream. She removed one pearl from her necklace and held it in her palm, the old signal between her and Theo. If the pearl dropped, she was being taken against her will. At the Bellini estate, Dante tried calling Nadia. Every call routed through council communications. They told him she was being cared for. They told him direct contact could compromise her protective placement. They told him to remain calm. He did not fully believe them, but he was still weak from the ambush, managed by doctors and council advisors who used the word stability the way other men used the word leash. Then the Varone contract was placed in front of him. If Dante signed a new alliance, Nadia would be returned under marital custody. He picked up the pen. He looked at the document one more time. The terms seemed reasonable, in the specific way that terms always seemed reasonable when read by a man who wanted desperately to believe there was a fast way out of a slow trap. A new alliance, a returned wife, a council satisfied. He had been a boss for 11 years. He had signed documents that ended feuds and documents that started them. He had never signed one that felt, in the moment of signing, like relief. This one did. That should have told him something. It did not yet. He picked up the pen. He nearly signed. Not because he was selling her, because he believed this was the way to bring her home. Then he stopped on the phrase itself, returned under marital custody. He said, to no one in the room, "Why does a husband have to sign to get back a wife who was never theirs to take?" That was the moment Dante began to understand. The council was not holding Nadia for him. They were holding her to control him. At the gala, Theo studied the paddle numbers. Each one carried a small contract ID etched in the corner. Not a donation ID, a contract ID. He had seen contract IDs before, in legitimate business, in the kind of paperwork that accompanied territory agreements and supply contracts. He had never seen one etched into a charity paddle, small enough that a casual glance would mistake it for a decorative serial number. It was not decorative. Each ID corresponded to a file. Each file corresponded to a woman. The paddle in his own hand carried a number 2, freshly assigned the moment he registered as a donor. He understood, looking at it, that the moment he raised it, he would become part of the same ledger he intended to break open. Not a donation ID, a contract ID. Father Aurelio told the room, patrons did not buy women. They sponsored protection. Nadia looked directly at him. She said, "A cage does not become honorable because rich men clap for it." Some of the crowd laughed, uncomfortable. She had rehearsed this line in her mind for the entire drive to the gala, knowing she would need at least one moment where she refused to perform the role they had written for her. She had decided, somewhere around the 3rd checkpoint, that dignity in a room like this could not look like silence. It had to look like a sentence sharp enough that no one in the audience could later claim they hadn't understood what was happening to her. Octavia Varone raised her paddle. She was 60, dressed in a deep wine color, with the kind of stillness that powerful people learned only after years of having every emotion read and used against them. She had attended 17 of these galas. She had never been seen to lose at one. The room watched her raise her paddle and made the assumption rooms like this always made about women like her. That she wanted to acquire something, that her coldness was ambition, that her silence was strategy aimed at gain rather than survival. Cold, beautiful, powerful, the kind of woman the room assumed wanted to acquire Nadia for herself. The patronage figure climbed. Theo watched the numbers rise on the display board and understood that the figure displayed was a performance for the room. A number meant to suggest generosity rather than reflect what was actually being exchanged. The real transaction was happening in a layer beneath the visible bidding, in a file somewhere with Nadia's name on it, in terms that had nothing to do with the dollar amount climbing on the screen. He had one chance to interrupt a system built specifically to survive interruptions like the one he was about to attempt. Father Aurelio said, "The Bellini widow will be placed under the most honorable protection." Theo understood the auction was closing. Once it closed, the transfer document would be signed. He had thought about this moment more than once on the drive to the gala. He did not have the money to outbid Octavia Varone or any of the patrons in this room. He did not need to. Money was not the weapons this system feared. The system feared its own verification protocol, the one Lucien had built to protect his oldest patrons from being impersonated. A protocol that, once triggered, could not be selectively stopped. He had not come with money. He had come with a donor paddle, quietly modified before the gala. Fitted with a small recording chip, he had no legal right to carry into a private auction. He raised his paddle. The room waited for a number. He said, "Lucien Vale." The system received the legacy bidder name. The screen behind the stage lit up. A line appeared. Trustee verification initiated. 90 seconds. The ledger opened. Father Aurelio went pale. He had stood at this podium for 15 galas and never once seen the system behave this way. Never once seen a verification protocol trigger outside of a closing transaction. He understood, watching the screen light up, that something had gone fundamentally wrong. With an evening he had spent months preparing. He did not yet understand what. He only understood that whatever it was bigger than anything he had been told to manage. He motioned for the screen to be cut, but the verification was already running on its own protocol. Theo stood. He said, "You called this charity, then opened the donation ledger. No one wanted to open it, because what had opened was not a donation ledger. It was a transaction ledger." In 90 seconds, Theo and Nadia read as much as the screen would give them. Transfer of protection, marriage control option, widow asset freeze, custody influence, alliance compliance, patronage renewal. Each line was a category. Each category was a woman somewhere who had been filed under it. Nadia understood, watching the category scroll, that this was not a single transaction built for her. This was infrastructure. A system built to process women the way a shipping company processed inventory, categorized, logged, transferred, and accounted for, with fees attached to every step. She was not an exception inside this ledger. She was an entry. Nadia's name had been entered before the gala began. She said, "I was not sold because I was weak. I was sold because they were afraid of what I knew." Theo began copying the data through a device hidden in the paddle frame. The system sent an alert. Lucien Vale had just learned his name had been spoken. Father Aurelio counterattacked immediately. He said Theo had just participated in the bidding. If Theo placed a bid, he too treated Nadia as property. Dante appeared through the council's communication screen. He had just received word that his guard had bid for his wife. His expression went cold. He said, "Theo, tell me I did not just watch my guard buy my wife." Theo looked directly at the screen. He said, "I did not buy her to own her. I bought the file they opened when they thought she was already property." Nadia stepped forward. She did not let Theo speak for her. She said, "If he wanted to own me, he would have bid with money. He bid with the name that made them afraid." The transaction file opened wider. Inside, Nadia's name, her status as protected widow, a proposed patron listed as Veroni, terms that required Dante to sign an alliance, and one line that read, "Return under marital custody upon compliance." Dante read that line. He understood it, the way a man understood something he had narrowly avoided doing, the particular cold clarity that arrived a few seconds after the danger had passed, rather than during it. He thought about the pen in his hand 3 days ago. He thought about how close he had come to signing his own name beneath that exact phrase, believing the entire time that signing was an act of love rather than an act of compliance. He understood. The very thing he had nearly signed was the chain meant for his wife's neck. A voice came through the gala's audio system, not Father Aurelio. An old voice, calm, cold as paper. It said, "Mr. Cross, a son should be careful when repeating the name that buried his mother." Theo went still. He had imagined, more than once, what he would say if he ever heard this man's voice. He had imagined demands. He had imagined threats he could meet with something equally sharp. He had not imagined this, a voice so calm it sounded almost bored. A voice that had clearly said worse things to better prepared people and watched them fold. The voice continued, "Your mother's file is still open, Mr. Cross. Files like hers do not close. They simply move to a different drawer." Theo's hand tightened at his side. Nadia looked at him. Lucien Vale, the man presumed dead, the man who had once entered Theo's mother into a ledger. The moment Lucien spoke, the gala doors locked. Security shifted formation. The ledger began deleting itself, line by line. A countdown appeared. Father Aurelio stood silent, a man who had just been pulled out of his own performance. Lucien said, "You are not being sold, Mrs. Bellini. You are being preserved until men capable of strategy decide where you belong." Nadia answered, "Then you should have preserved your own death certificate better." The room shuddered, because she had already seen in the ledger that Lucien's trustee account had continued collecting transaction fees years after his declared death. Lucien ordered Theo detained. Nadia was accused of conspiring with her bodyguard to disrupt the charity. Dante had not yet arrived. The auction transfer had minutes left before close. Nadia did not wait to be rescued. She walked to the edge of the stage, where the pearl had marked the camera's blind spot. Beneath the podium was the transfer envelope. She picked it up in front of the entire room. Inside was a prepared confirmation of voluntary protection, with a signature forged to look like hers. She recognized the forgery immediately. Her real signature curved differently at the final letter, a habit from childhood that no forger had ever managed to replicate correctly across the several attempts other families had made over the years to produce documents in her name. This one was close enough to convince a room that wanted to be convinced. Not close enough to convince her. She held it up so the cameras that were still recording, the legitimate ones, the gala's own press cameras, the ones Lucien could not reach from wherever he was hiding his voice, could see it clearly. She held it up. She said, "This is not charity. This is a signature they wrote before I ever touched the pen." Octavia Verone rose. Everyone expected her to defend the transaction. Instead, she removed her bracelet. It carried the same contract mark as Nadia's file. She said, "I survived by becoming what once bought me." She admitted she had once been a protected widow herself. To survive, she had become a patron. Not innocent, but a witness now. Theo used the remaining seconds of legacy access to push the ledger onto the main screen before Lucien could finish erasing it. The lines appeared. Names of widows transferred, assets frozen, custody rights reassigned, remarriage alliances forced, charity fees routed to a dead trustee's account, the name of Theo's mother, the name of Nadia's mother. Nadia saw her mother's name. Her voice broke for one beat. Then she straightened. She said, "You told me my mother was saved by this foundation. You buried her in a ledger." Lucien answered, "Without us, widows become liabilities." He said it with the calm certainty of a man repeating a belief he had built an entire empire upon. A belief tested and confirmed for him many times by many rooms that had agreed with him simply because disagreeing was inconvenient. He had never expected to be contradicted from this particular stage by this particular widow, with the evidence already glowing on the screen behind her. Nadia said, "No. Without you, widows become witnesses." The room did not applaud, but no one moved to silence her either. That, more than anything else that had happened tonight, told her the gala's old certainty had finally broken. Dante finally arrived with his men. He had driven faster than his doctors would have permitted, faster than the council's communications office had wanted, faster than a man recovering from an ambush should have driven. He had spent the entire journey rehearsing what he would say. Every version had started with himself. "I came for you. I will fix this. I am sorry." He arrived to find his wife standing on a stage, holding evidence in her own two hands, having already done the thing he had been rehearsing how to do for her. He understood, watching her, that the version of this moment he had imagined was wrong. This was not his rescue to perform. He did not step onto the stage to pull her down. He stood below it, lower than her. So the entire room understood. This time, the boss was not standing in front of his wife to speak for her. He was standing behind her evidence. Dante said, "No Bellini wife, widow, daughter, or mother will ever be listed in a patronage ledger again." Lucien ordered security to arrest Nadia. The men near the doors hesitated. They had taken orders from Lucien's voice for years without ever having a face to associate with the instructions, and faceless authority. Once openly contradicted by a room full of armed Bellini men, was a different kind of authority than it had been 5 minutes earlier. One guard reached for his radio rather than for Nadia. Theo stepped in front of her, but Nadia placed her hand on his shoulder, not to hide behind him, to stop him from turning this moment into his rescue. She said, "Let them try to arrest the woman they just admitted they sold." No one moved toward her. Dante ordered the trustee accounts frozen. Father Aurelio was detained. He did not resist. He had spent 15 years perfecting the language of generosity in this room, and now that the language had failed, he had nothing else prepared. He had never been the one who decided which women entered the ledger. He had only ever been the voice that made the entering sound like rescue. That distinction mattered, in the way that distinctions mattered to lawyers, and very little to the women whose lives had been filed under his careful language. He had known. That was the part that would follow him. Not that he had built the machine, but that for 15 years he had stood in front of it and called it kindness, year after year, gala after gala, smiling at rooms that wanted to believe him. That distinction would not save him from the accounting that was coming. The brokers in the room were held. Lucien's voice vanished from the audio feed, but the ledger had already been backed up. The trustee account that had received payments for years after Lucien's declared death now had a destination on record, an estate, a jurisdiction, a name on file that the dead man had never expected anyone to read. The dead man's silence had finally become evidence against him. The network was beginning to collapse. Nadia returned to the Bellini estate, not carried, not redeemed like property. She returned with the ledger. Dante stood before the council. He did not say, "I got my wife back." He said, "My wife was never lost property. She was taken by a law I was too slow to question." Nadia looked at him. She said, "You fought to bring me back to your house. But I needed you to ask who gave them the right to remove me from it." Dante lowered his head. He said, "Then I will repair the house before I ask you to stand inside it." She studied him for a long moment. She had expected an apology that asked for forgiveness in the same breath it was offered, the kind of apology that wanted to be finished as quickly as it started. This was not that. This sounded like a man who understood that an apology was the beginning of work, not the end of it. She said nothing in response, which was its own kind of answer. He did not write them quickly. He had signed many documents as boss. He had never signed any the way he signed these, slowly, deliberately, the way a man signed something when the signature itself was an admission that the document should have existed years earlier. He wrote 6 laws before the full council. No wife, widow, daughter, mother, or matriarch of the family could be declared a protected asset without her own direct and independent consent. No right of protection could be transferred through charity, patronage, alliance, donation, or marriage contract. Every widow's relief fund required an independent oversight board with at least one representative outside the benefiting family. No woman could be entered into an alliance contract as an asset, condition of exchange, or instrument of compliance. A guard had the right to intervene if the person under his protection was being transferred under the language of protection without her consent. Any charity ledger containing a contract ID related to marriage, custody, assets, or reprotection would be treated as evidence of trafficking in family control. Theo was not granted the right to keep Nadia. That distinction mattered to both of them, and Dante understood, having watched the entire gala unfold through second-hand reports and finally in person, that granting Theo possession of anything would have repeated the exact mistake the council had made with Nadia herself. What Theo received instead was authority. The authority to challenge any future transfer, any future protection clause, any future document that tried to move a Bellini woman without her direct consent. He was restored as her protector, recognized now as a primary witness. Dante looked at Theo. He said, "You bought my wife in front of a room full of enemies." Theo answered, "No, I bought the door they used to call her property." Nadia said, "And I walked out with the key." She looked at the ledger one more time before it was sealed into evidence. Somewhere in those pages was her mother's name, and somewhere else was Theo's mother's name, and somewhere beyond both of them were names she would never know. Women whose daughters and sons had been told some version of saved and never given a file to prove it. She could not bring all of them back. But she could make sure the drawer Lucien had built for hiding them was the same drawer that would now convict him. Nadia Bellini was brought to the Saint Aurelia Gala as a protected widow, dressed in silk, surrounded by champagne, and priced in the language of charity. But the auction had never been about generosity. It was about control. They were not selling bodies. They were selling signatures, custody, remarriage, and silence. Theo Cross did not buy Nadia to own her. He bought the file that proved she had already been treated as property. And by dawn, the Bellini family learned a rule every empire should fear. A wife is not an asset, a widow is not a contract, and no charity is holy if it needs a locked ledger to hide the names of the women it claims to protect. The gala lights were turned off before sunrise. The chandeliers stayed. The roses were thrown out, and somewhere in a sealed evidence room, a ledger that had once decided where widows would be sent next sat open for the first time in its history, waiting to answer for every name it had ever swallowed.